you. Thank you, everyone. That was a really boring bio. I have to rewrite it. Sorry about that. So it's a pleasure and honor to be here with you all today as you embark on your new strategy around empowering youth. And I have to say, I was a little nervous when I heard I had the spot right after lunch on the 4th day of your conference. And I was thinking, oh my God, the very nice Belarusian lunch that we all just had just now. I have a big task ahead of me, right, to keep you all engaged. So what we're going to do is make this interactive. So I'm going to ask you I'm going to present some ideas, and then I'm going to ask you to reflect on them and to think about what it means for your work, what it means for your work at the Y, what it means for specifically your work with respect to empowering young people. And then we'll have whoever would like to share with the group what your reflections are, we'll have you share back. So we'll make this interactive, and that's how I'm going to keep you from falling asleep. So to begin with, our topic of discussion today is about collective impact, right? So to begin with, how many of you, can you raise your hand if you have heard of collective impact? Raise your hand. Okay, quite a few, maybe half of you. Keep your hand up if you actually not just have heard, but actually understand what collective impact is. A few people, a few brave souls. Can we have that gentleman over there who had your hand up? Tell us what you think, your understanding of collective impact. There's a mic up front. Would you mind doing that? Gentleman in the white T-shirt. Okay, maybe not. Maybe later we'll come. Okay, yes, thank you.
You should have told me that if I put my hand up, I'd end up in this situation.
That's why I didn't.
Well, the way I would describe it is by using an example, if I could.
Yeah.
I'm from Canada. In Canada, we have an intractable social problem that has to do with injustice towards our Indigenous peoples. Mm-hmm. It's been something that there's been a lot of causes, but it's been something that we have not been able to solve. We've not been able to come together around this issue. So we have been working, the YMCA, along with 13 other organizations, to come together, Aboriginal organizations, youth-serving organizations, and public or community foundations. Yep. And we've come together to try to change the paradigm, to look at this a completely different way than we have before. Mm-hmm. And as a result, we're bringing Indigenous and non-Indigenous young people together to build relationship that will allow them to change our country by changing the narrative going forward. Mm-hmm. And that's something that no one organization could ever do alone. It can only be accomplished if organizations coming from very different perspectives can come together around one particular issue and make a collective impact.
That is very well explained. Thank you so much. Please, let's give the gentleman a big hand. So I could not have explained it better, which is why I called on you. So very simply, collective impact, as the gentleman very nicely explained, is about effective collaboration, right? If we accept that the most complex issues that we face as a society defy any one organization, even the largest government resources, it means that we all of us, NGOs, governments, youth organizations, funders, foundations, et cetera, need to come together, and private companies need to come together to solve our most complex problems. And that's the essence of collective impact. Now, when I first talked to Selma about doing this talk today, she said, I know you all at FSG are the experts in collective impact. That's actually not what I want you to talk about. So I said, okay, what would you like me to talk about? And she said, what I would like you to do is extract the principles from the principles of collective impact. What can we learn about what it takes to do collaboration in our network, right? So in your words, how can you strengthen your movement using the principles of collective impact? And that's what I'm going to talk about today. And as we go through this, again, as I mentioned, I might call on others, so I'm going to have you reflect on what this means for you. If we can have the first slide, please. Yeah, thank you. So collective, it's the nonprofit firm that I work for is called FSG. We coined this term, collective impact, about 5 years ago. And we certainly didn't invent effective collaboration, right? Because as you all know, in the communities that you work, you've been doing collaborations for many years, for many decades even. Our contribution has been to study effective collaborations, and what we did was we looked at over 100 collaborative efforts and distilled and identified between 2 and 3 dozen that we characterized as being effective. And what we meant by that was that these were collectives that were working together consistently over time and were solving complex social issues, very much as the gentleman described earlier. Okay? And we all know, I've worked in the social sector for many years now. All of you have been in this field for many years. And we've all been part of collaboratives that we feel we're just coming to the table and wasting our time. So it's very difficult to do collaboration and to do it well and effectively such that you're actually solving social problems. So what do these people do? So that's what the talk today is going to be about. But before I go there, what I'd like you to keep in mind is, so why is this important for you, for the why, at this point in your history? Now, what we find with collaboratives that work together effectively is that the whole is much greater than the sum of its parts, right? So you all have 12,000 associations, you work in 120 nations, and each of you are doing wonderful things in your community. But if you actually were connected as a network, as a movement, you can achieve much greater things than any of you can achieve on your own. And I'll show you with examples how others have done it, and would love for you to think about how this might apply to your work. I'll also finally say that collaboration, social change, social impact is very contextual, right? The same issue can have different solutions in Estes Park versus Denver, right? And it certainly can be different in different parts of the geographies that you all come from. However, what we have found is that collaboratives that work together effectively have certain things in common. So it's really interesting that no matter where you're working, effective collaboratives seem to do certain things in common. So what I would like you to keep in mind as you listen to this is some of this may not be relevant for you. Again, our work is very contextual, but I'm hoping that at least some of this will be relevant for your work. So what I would like to ask of you is that I invite you to think about what others have done and to think about what of those may be relevant to you. If there are certain things that are not relevant, just put that aside and just focus on the things that are relevant to you. Okay? So just keep that in your mind. So the next slide, please. So you all, as I mentioned, so when Selma said, I don't actually want you to talk about collective impact, I want you to talk about how that applies to collaboration in our network, I asked her, so what does that mean? What is your network? What do you mean by movement? And she explained to me, and I'm a member of the Y in my community, but I had never realized how really large this network was, so that you work in 120 countries, serve the millions of people that you do. And what this meant for us is that when I looked for examples, right, that I can bring to you all to say, these are other people who are doing collaboration effectively in their network, it needed to have a similar structure as you. So it needed to have a large geographic footprint, and it needed to be distributed. I think one of the distinguishing characteristics, if I may say that, about the Y and others who are similar to you is that there is autonomy, right? In your communities, you're doing what's right for those communities, so you have autonomy to do that. However, as a network, you can come together and be something and do something that's greater than each of you. So effective collaboration then needs to balance the two, needs to balance local autonomy with leveraging the power of the whole. So let's talk about how some others do it. Next slide, please. So we looked at, I'm going to use 6 examples, maybe I'll use 5 of these. And these are all, we picked them because they're similar to you. They're similar to you in that they're geographically distributed. They have many organizations or associations or people working in different places. And they balance, and they do this balance really well of local autonomy with leveraging the power of the network. And why do they do this? And here's why I think, as you think about what does it mean to strengthen your movement, what is the point of it? What is the purpose of strengthening the movement? I offer up 3 things that we've learned from studying these folks that I will talk about in more detail. One is that there is learning that you all are doing in your communities. As you do your work, you're learning about what works and what doesn't work. Now, how wonderful if you can share that, right? How wonderful if somebody in India, right, there are quite a few of you from the YMCA in India, can learn from what's happening with Aminata and her work in Liberia, right? Or how the US can learn from other parts of the world and vice versa, right? So there is great power in the learning that you all are doing in the community, and how can you synthesize that such that it informs the work of the rest of you? So that is what collaboratives that collaborate, the networks that collaborate effectively do that and do that really well. And I will talk in a minute about exactly how they do it to give you some ideas for what you might think about. So that's one. The second, and I'm going to go to the third box and then come back to the second, it's about systems change. So one of the things the gentleman mentioned earlier is that some of the most intractable, complex issues that we face cannot be solved with any one intervention. So if you take public education in the US, which is an area that I do a lot of work in, is that the best after-school program cannot solve the problem, right? The system itself needs to be aligned. We need to have the right laws, right policies and regulations. We need to have the right delivery mechanisms. These are schools, leaderships, and so on and so forth. And you need all of that. The system needs to be healthy in order for us to solve social problems. And the thing about systems issues, especially if you take policy and advocacy, is that it's very hard for us as individual organizations to affect policy. Inevitably, you find you need to come together with others to affect policy. So that's the second thing that networks that collaborate effectively find benefit in, is in doing these things that transcend their own work. And policy and advocacy is one great example, but there are many other examples of that. And the third is that if you can do this in your communities and you can do this larger things that you can't do individually but you can do collectively, the scale of impact you can have collectively is much larger. And what happens as a result of that? If you can articulate that impact you're having at scale across the network, you can mobilize resources in ways that are much harder to do as just individual organizations, right? And again, the examples that I will talk about all do this really successfully when they can articulate how everything that happens in different communities, how it adds up to something that's larger. Okay, so keep this in your mind. And the other thing I would also want to make sure I mention is that the Y has a long history. You have a long and illustrious history. You've done many great things and continue to do so. So as you listen to what others are doing, I would like you to also acknowledge what the Y is already doing, right? So, because I think you will recognize that many of the things that I say, you already do. But what I would also like you to do is then take that to the next level and ask the question, are we doing this consistently and intentionally across the network? Or do we just do it in isolated ways in certain places? Because what we find is that often these ideas exist, especially if you're working in 120 countries across 12,000 associations. Somebody is doing stuff, right? The trick here is to recognize and lift that up, and for all of us to do that in a consistent and intentional way. And so that's what I'd like you to keep in mind. So if it seems familiar, it shouldn't be surprising. Somebody's, I'm sure, doing these things. Think about how you can lift it up and make it intentional and consistent across the network, and that's your task, okay? Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So what do these people do? What do effective collaboratives actually do to be effective? So we distilled these 4 things, and this, again, draws from the principles of collective impact that we've been working on for many years now. And there are 4 things, and we're calling them building blocks. So starting with the bottom, a shared understanding of the issue. What that means is that a shared understanding of the joint problem that we are going to address. In your case, it's youth empowerment. We'll get into more detail of exactly how these effective collaboratives define the shared issue. They go beyond simply stating the vision. They do more, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So that's the first thing. The second thing is a collective approach. So now that you know what is the issue you're addressing, what are some best practices you can use? How can you start to think about what you do about it? Because if you take youth empowerment or you take health or you take any of these issues that you all are focusing on, they're large and complex, right? How do you start? How do you think about what to do? So effective networks, again, in their collaboration, provide some guidance or principle for collective approaches that are known to work, right? Again, this is where that balancing act becomes really important because you cannot prescribe solutions. If you prescribe solutions, that is a sure recipe to kill the innovation that happens on the ground, but you can provide principles and best practices that can inform all our work. So effective collaboratives do that really well, and I'll talk about what that means in a moment. The third is shared measures of success. So beyond having a shared understanding of the issue, effective collaboratives also define in very specific and measurable terms what success looks like. How will we know that we've been successful? What will we measure that will tell us that not just that we're successful, that we're making progress towards a success? Because in the kinds of issues that we work on, it'll take decades, right, before we can declare any success. So what we need to know is that we're making progress towards our ultimate goal. So having shared measures is a very effective way of doing that. The fourth thing, and this is the building block that's on top and looks like the roof of the house, and it's intentionally so, is continuous learning. And this is where what I mentioned earlier about learning comes in. Using the shared understanding of the problem, using your shared measures, and using your collective approach, effective networks take all of that and help the associations learn, okay? And so again, we'll talk about, there are some specific things that the examples that I'll talk about do that can give you some ideas for, either things you're already doing, you can lift up, or new things you might try. So let's go to the next slide and start with the first one, shared understanding. So the shared understanding of an issue typically consists of two things. One is a definition or the vision for change, and in your case, it's youth empowerment. And the second is a definition of what success looks like in a very measurable way. So let's take an example and look at exactly what that looks like. The first is GAIN, which is the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. Put up your hands if you know GAIN, and I'm not going to call on you to explain, so you can put your hands up. How many of you have heard of the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition? Okay, maybe a few of you. Okay, I think you're afraid I'm going to call on you. That's why you're not putting up your hands. There must be more of you who've heard of GAIN. In any case, the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition was incubated at a United Nations General Assembly special session for children back in 2002 to address malnutrition. Okay, so they are a network. They work in 30 countries, and they are a network of about 600 partners. And this includes private corporations, it includes foundations, it includes NGOs, it includes governments, includes many different kinds of actors. And together, their vision for change, so their shared understanding of the issue, is that very simply it's about ending malnutrition. Okay, so that is their vision. However, they don't stop there. They go beyond that to say, how do they know what success looks like? For them, success looks like, in very measurable terms, improving nutrition for 1 billion individuals who are in need, and half of those, 500 million, will be women and children who are malnourished. So that's one metric, if you like, that they can measure to know that they've been successful. The second, and that tells you the reach, right? The number of people you reach. And you have a similar metric around reaching number of youth. But beyond the reach, they also look at, so what will change for these individuals? So we would reach these billion individuals, but what will change? And they define it as follows. Reducing micronutrient deficiencies worldwide by 20 to 30%. So for this billion people, they're looking to reduce micronutrition deficiencies by 20 to 30%. They also say that they will eliminate malnutrition for children in the first 1,000 days of their life, again, within these billion people. So why is this important? The reason it's important is because in addition to knowing the number of people you're going to reach, it is useful to know what the change in social condition you're going to affect for these people. It helps you articulate what the impact at scale is you're having across the network. It allows you to add up the work of the work that you're doing in different communities in ways that can be communicated in succinct terms that goes beyond reach to actually saying what is the change in social condition. Okay, so that's the GAIN example. The second example here is a US-based example called Strive. The YMCA in Greater Cincinnati is actually a founding member of Strive. Is there anyone here who's familiar with Strive or from the YMCA in Greater Cincinnati? No, I don't see any hands. But you all are, very much at the table and doing this great work there. And what Strive does is that they are a cradle-to-career effort that is looking, and their vision is supporting the success of every child through the education pipeline to get successfully into careers, right? So they look from cradle, i.e. the time a child is born, all the way to the time the child enters a career. They look at that whole span, and they look at that in specific communities. So the Strive network operates in 49 communities around the U.S. So this is a U.S.-specific example. In 49 communities around the country, and they're all looking at it cradle to career. So how do they define? So as I mentioned, they define their shared understanding of the issue in two ways, which is the vision statement. In their case, I'll repeat it, supporting the success of every child from cradle to career. And then they go beyond that, right, to say what is the change in social conditions. So for them, success looks like the following. It looks like 5 things. It looks like being prepared to enter school. So this is kindergarten preparedness. It means succeeding in the schools. It means graduating from school. It means enrolling in post-secondary credentialing, and then it means graduating into a successful career. And for each of these, they have measures that I'm going to talk about when we get to the shared measures section, but they have specific measures for how they measure this. Now, what does this mean for balancing local autonomy and while at the same time leveraging the power of the network? So these may seem pretty specific. So if you take the GAIN example, if they stopped by just saying malnutrition, it is too hard at the end of the day for the network to add up all that's happening across its network. You need to have something more specific beyond that actually says what the change in condition is that can be adapted to local communities, right? And the things that GAIN has chosen are high level enough that can be applicable in different communities because you can translate that into malnutrition efforts that is right for your community. Okay? So the trick here is to define this at a high enough level such that it's applicable across a plurality of communities, but at the same time gives you the power as the network to add it up at the end of the day and say what difference have you made at scale. Okay? So I'm going to suggest now that you take just 2 minutes. And I'd like you to write down. So take out a pen and a piece of paper if you have it, or for those of you who are the digitalati, you can use your electronic equipment that you have. And just write down these things. How is this resonating with you? This notion of having a shared understanding, how is this resonating with you? How does this compare with what you've already defined, what the Y has already defined around empowering young people? So you do have you have a vision, certainly. You have some goals around reach. And you have health, employment, environment, and civic engagement, right? So you've been rather specific. So what we've just talked about, what does that mean for how you might define your shared understanding? What do you already have, and where can you do something else, something different? So just take 2 minutes to think about it, and you can talk to your neighbor if you like, okay? Good, done? Great. So let's move on to the next slide, please. So the second building block is collective approach. And what this is once you have a shared understanding, the network can provide some guidance or principles for best practices that are known to work. So in the 2 examples we talked about earlier, GAIN, their approach, and typically you find that this approach, this definition of approach can take different forms. It can be about what do you do to address malnutrition, for example, or what do you do to provide success from cradle to career, or it can be how do you work, right? So there are 2 different kinds of things that you see in this collective approach. In the sort of what do you do category, GAIN has sort of 3 approaches that they do. One is large-scale food fortification. The second is micronutrient supplements. And the third is what they call biofortification, which is fortifying agricultural staples, which is what a lot of low-income folks tend to rely on for their calories. And these are the sort of 3, generally best practices or best ways in which you can get leverage change on malnutrition. And so they put this out there for the network, and they operate in a very decentralized way. So they never tell countries what to do. So the countries can then pick, right? So if you live in a country where salt iodization is not yet happening, then you can do that, right? And GAIN will provide the technical assistance for you to do that. But if you live in a country where wheat, like in India, is the big staple, then you can fortify that with iron. In China, they fortify soy sauce, right? So the local context, again, is very different. You can that may be right for you. And in some places, food fortification may not make sense. You might want to do micronutrients, or you might say, okay, agricultural biofortification is what's right for us, or maybe there's a fourth or a fifth thing that may be more relevant for your context. But they provide this simply as a guidepost to say, this is what the global community that's working on nutrition has found to have impact at scale, and it's up to you to use this as you wish. Okay? But I think what they do find is that vast majority of their associations in their network do use at least one of these three things, if not more. Because that's where the power and the leverage and learning comes from when you do similar things. For Strive, I mentioned those 5 things, right? Being ready for school, being successful in school, graduating, and so on and so forth. They also have 21 strategies that they have put out there, again, as a guidepost to their communities to say, these are the things that we found to work. And that includes things like, in the very early stages of a child's life, home visitation. This is something that happens quite a lot in the US. That in low-income settings, low-resource settings, where a welfare worker might come to your home and do home visits to help you with nutrition and so on and so forth in the development of a child at an early stage. They also focus a lot on early childhood education. They focus on teacher training and so on and so forth. So 21 strategies is what they put out there. Again, the different communities, depending on where they are, they all take a cradle-to-career view, but exactly what they do, those interventions that they do in their community, tends to be different and tends to be localized. But again, providing some sort of guidepost or best practices to put out there so that the network can leverage that is something that both GAIN and Strive do. So that's on the collective approach on the what do you do side. Now, the collective approach on how you do it, so the example I'm going to use here is living cities. This is another US example. So a lot of our work tends to be in the US. So we also do work internationally, but I apologize for if some of these are more US-centric. But Living Cities is a partnership of 22 of the world's largest financial institutions like JP Morgan, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and so on and so forth, as well as foundations like Gates, Annie Casey, and so on. They work in about 100 cities around the country on what they call community development. And typically, community development tends to be housing and economic development. So this is what they do in 100 cities around the country. They've been around for about 22 years now. And what they provide for their network is a guidance around how to work. And they describe it in sort of 4 ways. One is around research and development. So their specific areas of interest are education, income and asset building, green economy, and transit development. So across this, they do very intensive R&D to understand what are the best practices, what's happening, and then they share that with the network. So this is actually very similar to what you're doing with 1 million voices, right? You're understanding what is it that youth want around the world, and then you're going to share that back with the network. So R&D, that type of thing, is one thing that Living Cities does. The second thing that they do is local integration. So they help the associations understand how it is you can bring together, again, as the gentleman described at the beginning, how you can bring together government resources with private sector resources, with foundation resources and NGO resources, so that together you can solve this complex issue of housing and economic development. So that's what they call local integration. So that's the second sort of best practice they've put out there to say, in your communities, whatever it is you're doing, try and do it in a locally integrated way. So that's the second approach. The third is leadership and influence. And here they've recognized that a lot of times the local leadership working on housing and economic development don't actually know perhaps how to do this integration, how the interconnections between the private sector and the government can actually be leveraged to greater impact. So they do a lot of leadership development. They do what they call boot camps to help people understand how it is you can do that integration and how we can all work together. And the fourth thing that they do is knowledge and evaluation. And this actually ties very well to what I'm going to talk about next, which is shared measurement. And this is, I will venture to say, out of the 4 building blocks that I put up earlier, the third one, can we go to the next slide, please? The third one, which is shared measures, is probably the one that we find that's missing in a lot of collaboratives. However, the very effective ones always make a point of doing shared measurement. So what is shared measurement? It is very simply boiling down what you put out in your vision, in your shared understanding, which is the first building block, about what the changes that you're going to make, and some high-level indicators. So like in the case of GAIN, it was 1 billion people and reducing malnutrition. Bringing that down to the next level to say, so how do we measure this in our communities? So Strive, for example, has 54 indicators that they use across that cradle to career, right? So these, again, are 54 indicators that they're putting out there to the community. Not everyone has to use everything, but it saves the network and the associations in the network a lot of time. They don't have to reinvent this, right? They can learn from what others have done and apply it in their work. Okay, so that's one example of shared measurement. The other example I'm going to talk about is success measures data system, and this is another community development example in the US. It's about 300 organizations that have partnered to do housing and economic development across the country. And they have defined 250 measures that actually tell you what it means to make a difference in housing and economic development. I'll give you some examples of what they use. So in housing, they look at affordability of housing, so monthly, what do you pay and how does that compare to what you make? They look at the quality of your housing. They look at neighborhood security, right? And they look at the sense of community. So these are things that, on the surface of it, we may all think about, but they then go to the next step of saying, so how do you actually measure it? So in addition to providing those indicators, they also provide tools. So they provide surveys. So if you wanted to get at neighborhood security, for example, how do you do a survey? What kind of questions do you ask to get at things like neighborhood security and sense of community? And then they, in addition, also have a system where you can enter this data and where they can generate reports for you. So I would say success measures data system is probably on the extreme example of a shared measurement system that I've seen, where they do the soup to nuts. It's not just the indicators, but also the tools by which you measure, as well as a system that can store and help you analyze and provide reports. What we find is that effective collaboratives are all along that spectrum. I will say that Strive in their early years actually just use a Google Doc. So you don't need a fancy system to make shared measurement work. In fact, even if you have a set of shared outcomes, that can actually be really helpful. You can take that to progressively next levels if you are going to find that, if the network is going to find that to be helpful. So I'm going to pause for a minute here and say a few words about why this is important and why this promotes learning. And then I'd like you, again, to take a couple of minutes of reflection and think about how this applies, if it applies to your work and how it might apply. Now, when we talk about learning, I think we use that word quite a lot. Everybody uses that word quite a lot. We certainly use that word quite a lot. But to do learning effectively is really difficult, right? Because often I'm in situations where people are coming together and they're talking about what they did in their community. And that's well and good, and that is interesting, but it doesn't necessarily promote learning, right? It doesn't necessarily promote you to say, okay, how should I do my work differently? It might spark some ideas, but in a more systematic way to learn what's working and what isn't is what shared measurement systems or shared measures actually start to get you. Because if across the network you're defining, say in your health, employment, environment, and civic engagement, what success looks like, right? And you can, I assure you, define this in ways that does not hinder the autonomy, because it can be, you pick and choose what's right for you, right? But you can provide that guidance. That it provides you a mechanism to come together and say, I think Strive is actually a really good example, where they don't set the goal as 80% graduation rates. They don't say all communities need to get to 80% graduation rates. What they do is have you measure your baseline, right? So whether it's kindergarten readiness or fourth grade reading or fourth grade math, they have you measure your baseline, and when you come together, you talk about progress from baseline. And so what you're learning from each other is people who've made larger progress from baseline, what's happened. And because you're doing it across areas that are somewhat similar, it promotes a type of learning that's very hard to do with just anecdotal stories. And stories are a very, very useful way to illustrate something that the data tells you, but it cannot replace the data. Okay, so it's a bit of a, kind of a distinction, because stories can be really powerful and it should be used, but when used in the right way, it can really promote learning. And that, and used in the right way, typically means it's telling you something about what the broader trends that you're seeing in the data, and you're using stories to illustrate that. Right? So this is why shared measures, that's one reason why shared measures is really important, because it enables learning, which is typically a very difficult thing to do. The second thing it allows you to do is communication, which I know is one of your strategic priorities. Right? So if you're going to look across your network and say, what has all our work added up to? How are you going to communicate that out? You have some specific ways in which you can do that if you have shared measures. Okay? So I've just put a lot out there to you all, so I'd like you to sort of, again, take just 2 minutes and just think about, how is this relevant to us? How is this relevant to our work in youth empowerment? What are we already doing today? What can we do more consistently across the network? And what do you see the challenges of us actually starting to do something like this? So just take a couple of minutes, and you can talk to your neighbor again. Okay, continuous learning. So this is the final building block. So this is, as I mentioned earlier, learning is a hard thing to do, but let me sort of maybe give some examples, rollback malaria and living cities, for how it is that they do it. So it gives you, might give you some ideas for what you might do. So rollback malaria was started back in 1998 by WHO, UNICEF, UNDP, and so on and so forth, and their vision is to eradicate malaria. And they organize their learning in sort of 2 ways. One is they have learning groups around topics. So they have a learning group around malaria in pregnancy, for example. They have another learning group around vector control. They have another one around procurement and supply of medicines for malaria. So it's arranged around topics, such that when the working group or learning group comes together, they're really learning based on that particular topic that they put out for themselves. Okay, so this is sort of how you can organize yourself. The other way in which they also organize themselves for learning is by sub-regions. So they have the West African sub-regional working group. They have the North African sub-regional working group, and so on and so forth, because, again, they recognize that the approaches for eradicating malaria are quite different in different communities, and so they bring them together in regional ways. And so those are, again, sort of ways in which, sort of structures, if you like, for doing learning. The other, so this is how you can organize yourself, and then there's sort of what is the information that feeds in to this learning, right? And that's where the other 3 building blocks come in. So using your shared approach, your collective approach, and using your shared measurement often tends to be, so you can imagine how the collective approach can be topical working groups, right, around which you can come around for learning. You can also use your shared measures to say, okay, if we've progressed this much from baseline on this issue, what did we learn, and can we come together around that? So these are ways in which you can organize yourself for learning. So I think, with all of that, we have Post-it notes we've put up on the side wall on my left to your right and on the back, where those thoughts that you jotted down for yourself for what you're already doing and what else you can do, if you could put it up on those Post-it notes, that will really help you all sort of take some things forward or to talk about what it is that might be challenging for you all. So we are out of time and unfortunately can't have a discussion about this as we were hoping. But I leave you with this and invite you to just think about it and take from it what you think is relevant for you. And I thank you for being a wonderful audience and wish you all the best.